Hi, Charlene.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, good. You good?
Hello, Dennis.
Hi, Jeff. How are you?
I'm okay. Did you get the email I sent you?
I did.
Today?
The PowerPoint is all queued up.
Oh, good.
I've got
Well,
the
hopefully I'll figure out how to do it over from this end.
I've got the video queued up too.
Okay, great.
You want to test out screen sharing quickly?
Yeah, like I said, I've never done this before, so what do I do here?
All right, at the bottom of the screen, you have a bunch of tools.
Yeah, I see where it says share screen.
Right. So click on that.
Click on that, okay. And it says, I have a choice of entire screen, window. If I do entire screen, what happens? Why don't I do window first and see what happens? I'm just not sure how I get to my, let me see if I can bring up the PowerPoint. Now, can you see that okay?
No.
No, nuts.
You're
Uh,
not sharing the screen yet. Try share the screen again.
okay, let me go back to. Try entire screen this time and see if that works. Nope, that didn't do anything.
Can you see my screen now? I shared it.
Yeah, I can see yours, but there's I've got a partial window that's blocking most of what I can see on your screen. Let me change to window and try that. Nope, that's not working.
You working on a PC or a Mac?
I'm working on a PC. It's a government laptop. And like I say, what I see now, it says choose what to share. And it gives me the choice of entire screen, a window, or Microsoft Edge tab. And I tried the first two and those haven't worked. Let me try the third thing.
Okay. I'm seeing your web browser now. Are you running this through the browser? Jeff, you're muted now.
You're muted.
Are you running this through the Zoom app or through the browser?
Through the browser. When I
That
tried to join directly, it wouldn't let me when I pressed launch meeting.
That may be the problem. So I can just run it and you just tell me when to move
Okay.
forward.
Okay. I'm glad
Yeah.
you've got experience in this. Like I said, all the programs I've given in the past, I've actually been there and I've, presented them right with the laptop right in front of me. This is the first time I've tried this share screen, and I'm sorry it's not working.
No problem. It's not the first time either, so.
Yeah, I can see your screen now. All right, well, let me turn off my PowerPoint since I don't need that.
Yeah, we run a pre-show
Okay.
slideshow.
Oh, neat.
By the way, I had an email from someone who knows you yesterday. She's working with Bird Migration Explorer for Audubon,
And who was that?
Jill Deppy.
Oh, yeah. She's
And,
married to the wife. She's the wife of the chief of the banding lab down
Yeah,
here.
she said to say hi.
Okay. I'll
she's
tell her
asked me
husband hi
to
back.
she's asked me to be a tester with some of the features of the Bird Migration Explorer, and I had already used it to illustrate. I think you probably saw it. Illustrate the Northeast breeding areas
Yes.
and the staging areas from the Bird Migration Explorer. So I sent her a link to that, and she thought that was pretty cool use of it, and she said
Yeah.
to say hi.
I haven't seen her for a couple of years, and I haven't spoken to her husband for a while because most people down here are still teleworking. They haven't gotten back in the office on a regular basis yet.
Right.
Have you played around with that much?
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Oh, good.
I also told her when I replied to her that they're going to be getting some data from us shortly, as we're going to be putting a Motus tower in along New Haven Harbor.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. Give it a couple more minutes for people to sign in, and then we'll get started. Oh, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Dennis Reardon, president of Menunkatuck Audubon Society, and I'm looking forward to tonight's program. As always, Menunkatuck wishes to honor the indigenous communities native to the chapter area, including the Bagusset, Wepawak, Quinnipiac, Tuttakat, Menunkatuck, and Hammonasset people. As we advocate for the conservation of land and its wildlife, we're indebted to the work of Native and Indigenous people who cherished the land for thousands of years before European colonization. A couple of announcements before we get going. First of all, there's some exciting news from the Connecticut State Legislature. The Lights Out bill has been reported out favorably from the Environment Committee. Bill banning horseshoe crab harvesting and the rodenticide bill have also been passed, reported out favorably from the Environment Committee. Next steps will be to get them before the full legislature. So stay tuned for information about how you can help get these important bills through. Upcoming programs are gardening with frog and toad on Tuesday, April 11th. Gina Nickel will be here on May 9th, Tuesday. Good looking, how to get better views of birds. And then Corey Folsom O'Keefe will tell us how to shear the shore on Wednesday, May 24th. As always, if you have questions during the program, please put them in the chat. And at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. And if something comes up that's not in the chat, you can unmute yourself at that time and ask your question. In the meantime, during the program, please mute yourself. Well, Dr. Jeffrey Spendelow is a longtime Menunkatuck member and has been doing research on Roseate Terns since he helped start the Falkner Island Tern Project in 1978. In 1981, the focus turned pretty much completely to Roseate Tern research due to concerns of the declining North Atlantic breeding population of this species. So tonight we'll learn how scientists have discovered more in the past 40 years about Roseate Terns. Jeff?
Hi. Do you want to start with the movie, Dennis? I'll
Okay.
give a little introduction if you want to bring that up.
Yep.
This movie exists because several years ago, my former supervisor came up to visit a friend of hers on Cape Cod, and we all had dinner together. And turns out the woman was a filmmaker and was fascinated by the stuff I was telling her about I was doing out on the Cape, the outer part of the Cape. And she said, gee, I'd like to make a movie about that. And that's what you're about to see right now. So I'll mute myself and you can turn the sound on for that.
Are you hearing that?
I am not hearing it.
We just want to be at the water's edge. We want to walk.
Let me
We just don't pay attention to who else wants.
stop and start again.
And for the birds, it's these short little flights. It's the getting up in the air that takes a lot of the calories. Once they're up and flying, it's a lot easier to maintain yourself in the air. When they're migrating, they go up high enough to find the right tailwinds, maybe, so they can make that flight down there. But all these short little flights here to get out of the way, people just sort of keep pushing them down the beach, or dogs chasing them, stuff like that. That's what's costly.
Here we go. Here we go.
But these terns, they're going to make one huge flight and then make another quite a big flight as well. And they need to be prepared for it. From here, they'll probably be making a direct flight down to the Caribbean. We've had records of our birds being seen in Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Dominica, Guadeloupe, some other islands down there. We think they only stage there for a day or two, but then we think they make essentially an overwater flight from there all the way down to the north coast of South America. Maybe one of the Guyanas sitting on Brazil, but eventually they'll get to Brazil. And it's somewhere, once they get down there, we think that the young become truly independent of the adults.
Right now we have over 1,500 nests marked. We have about 1,200 chicks banded with PFRs, so we'll be able to recite them. So we're already building a history. This is a really good year for roseate so far. And if the fish holds out, then we can call it extremely successful.
So by putting a band, you are basically having an individual sign for that particular bird. When you do it in a chick, you get even more information because you know the age. And then when these birds are coming back to breed, you will know their age, and this will allow demographic studies to see survival, age at first breeding, pairing, movements between colonies and things like that.
In tern species, at least in roseates and commons, they do share the responsibility of brooding. Sometimes they hang around and they're waiting for the other one to get up, but they are waiting for their turn. Once the chick is hatched, both parents take turns going out and fishing and coming back with the appropriate size fish, hopefully. Hopefully they can afford to be picky. If the fish is good, then they can get the right size for the right chick. If it's too hot, the adults will dip down and skim in the ocean and get water in their breast, and so it's cool, and the chick will come under the parent, and the parent will feel cool because it's been in the water. So they'll do that if it gets hot, and obviously if it's cool and it's chilled, because even though they have nice thick down, it's a small little creature, so they're probably trying to get warm. The other thing is just it is essentially a version of a hug. You're not too far off because it feels safe under its parent.
The population has started to go back up since about 2012. It had dropped drastically between 2000 and 2008, and then it kind of stuttered along for the next 4 years. And then since 2012, it started to go back up again to the point where we may be at our record high since the species was declared endangered, or very close to approaching the record high that we had in the year 2000. We have looked at adult survival during the period back in the past when the population declined versus when it was increasing. And there was no difference in adult survival rates in those periods. Productivity does vary from year to year, but there was no sustained lower productivity during the period of population decline. So the main thing is survival from fledging to when they first come back as breeding birds. And what we're focusing on now is looking at when they all come together here at Cape Cod, all the young of the year, what things could be influencing either their direct mortality while they're here or influencing their ability to prepare for that first long flight down to South America and their overwinter survival. There's the problem that when the flocks get scared quite a bit and actually fly off quite a distance, that any cases where young have been left behind by the adults while the adults go out and feed, when the adults come back with the food, they can't find Junior where they left him. So then he has to figure out, okay, where is Junior? And I have seen birds flying around with fish in their beaks, calling, flying figure eights, and then eventually flying out of range, going to find out where the flock went. Again, this is impacting the birds by the fact that Junior isn't going to get fed as much. And potentially, if he gets entirely separated from whoever's taking care of him, eventually it will cause mortality. One case of a young Roseate Tern where it got separated, and I watched it get weaker and weaker, and then it just totally disappeared. We don't usually find the bodies because there are coyotes out here and other things that scavenge bodies. When the adult comes back with a fish, it's usually calling, making a contact call, the chivik call. And if you are looking at the young, you will see them perk up. Oh, there's Dad. Dad's got food. And usually the roseates will take the young and actually draw them out of the flock, fly off a little distance so they can feed it without being interfered with by other terns, or by, in this particular case up here, we have a lot of problems with laughing gulls that are stealing food. The roseates seem to do a better job of keeping that from happening than the common terns do.
They're still on the endangered species list. So what's happening? What is prompting them to continue to stay on the endangered species list? Is it mostly food production? Is something happening during migration? Is it wind farms now we have to contend with? Site selection, you know, is their habitat declining? So there's a lot of things that we're trying to figure out in order to keep the species going.
The recovery goal is 5,000 pairs overall, and we need to have 6 colonies of 500 or more pairs. We could get to the 5,000 part of it. We're not there yet. We're up to maybe back to 4,000 pairs total. But the problem is going to be getting to having that many colonies of over 500 pairs. There are only 2 really good places for the roseate terns right now to nest at. The main problem is the survival of the birds once they've left the breeding colonies before they start to come back as breeding birds. So what can we do? Where is this happening? And we think Cape Cod is a good place to start because essentially all the young of the year are coming here. It's the hub, if you will, for the roseate flight line down to South America. Most of the birds that we're seeing in the flocks are common terns. Common terns in the northeast of U.S. probably outnumber roseate terns, better than 50 to 1 overall. When you have the big flocks, those are dominated by the common terns. So yeah, you're seeing a lot of birds, but just remember, only 1 in 20 is likely to be a roseate. And they need this place so that their young can get ready to make those big flights and then survive and eventually come back as breeding birds. What we just need is a little bit of area where these guys can rest on their own, where they're not going to be bothered by people walking through the flocks every couple of minutes, or by the dog chasing them off somewhere, so that when Dad comes back with the food, he can't find Junior. Like the sign says, give them a break. If you can, walk around them. You don't need to be that close to them. You don't need to be right at the water's edge. But that's where they do need to be, because they need to bring fish back, they need to feed their young, and they need to be able to see predators coming. So that's why they want to be right out there. It's not that much, and their life does depend on it.
We go to the PowerPoint now.
Yeah. Unless if anybody has any questions about the film, maybe I can answer them now while they're still fresh in people's mind.
Let's see. I had one question about the breeding. What's the productivity of the roseates?
It typically averages about 1 chick per pair per year, but it varies a lot from place to place. The colony sites with the biggest number of pairs at Great Gull Island and at 2 of the sites in Buzzards Bay on good years can produce up to 1.2 chicks per pair. Smaller colony sites, they might have a couple good years, but they also might have a lot of bad years. And one of the questions that came in on the chat was whether or not there are still birds at Falkner, and the answer is yes. But as I recall from Chris Vegas, who's a biologist for the McKinney Refuge out there, they only raised 3 chicks there last year from, I think it was 4 pairs of birds. So I'm really worried. That was my original study site, and it's about to wink out on us. And it used to be the 3rd largest roseate tern colony site in Northwest Atlantic.
Wow.
You know, when I first started there, I think we had about 250 pairs.
Wow, what a difference.
Yeah. The main driver, we think, of the loss of birds at that particular colony site was black crowned night heron predation. But then when they built the revetment to protect the lighthouse, that wasn't helpful to the birds either. And the last couple of years, even though they got the night heron predation problem under control at Falkner. They weren't, for a couple of years, they weren't able to get out much as they wanted to during the COVID years. And we think the night herons came back and had pretty much decimated the roseates there.
Well,
Okay, while Dennis is bringing that up, I'll just start with a little introduction. I first visited Falkner Island off the coast of Guilford back in 1977. At that point in time, the Northwest Atlantic breeding populations of roseates nested from as far southwest as Breezy Point out on Long Island, York, up to northeastern Nova Scotia, and a few islands at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River in Quebec, Canada. Since that time, though, the last 40-something years, their breeding range has contracted severely around the edges. They no longer nest in substantial numbers along the south shore of Long Island. And like I said, we're close to losing them as breeders at Falkner, which now is currently the largest, or it had been up until the last couple of years ago, the most southwestern colony left for this species. The picture you're seeing here shows the area where about 85% of the population breeds, mostly at just 3 colony sites. Great Gull Island, which is off the North Fork of Long Island, New York, about where Dennis has his pointer going there. And then there are a couple colony sites up in Buzzards Bay, Bird Island and Ram Island on the upper part of Buzzards Bay, which is just to the west of Cape Cod there, the famous biceps arm of southeastern Massachusetts. It also shows that area around Cape Cod where virtually the entire breeding population, all the young of the year, just about, and many of the adult looking but non-breeding roseates spend 1 to 2 months preparing for the migration to South America. And although I'm giving the talk, go ahead and hit the next part, Dennis. This talk is actually the result of the work by many people working at colonies, all these colony sites across the entire range from Connecticut up to Nova Scotia, doing all the banding. I've actually stopped banding the birds. I left working at Falkner. 2003 was my last year there. I worked for several years in the breeding colony sites in Buzzards Bay through 2010. But after that, starting in 2011, I've been focusing on what's going on out in the staging areas, and particularly the outer part of the Cape, areas which are all within the boundary of Cape Cod National Seashore. Next. Okay, so many years ago, the Fish and Wildlife Service asked the big question, as I call it. Next. And that is, what are the major factors limiting the recovery of endangered roseate terns? And it was our work basically done at Falkner back in the late 70s and early 80s, which provided the facts necessary for the Fish and Wildlife Service to have the species declared endangered. And so now, once it got declared endangered, the next question is, well, what's going on? What's causing the low population problem? Next. So in 1987, when I moved up back from Louisiana, I did an internship down there. I came back up to Maryland. I and several others formed what has become the Cooperative Roseate Tern Metapopulation Project. You'll see the letter CRTMP in here, to try to start finding answers to some of these questions. Next. Now we've made a lot of progress, next, but we still have a lot, much more to learn. In particular, what happens between the time that they leave the staging sites in the fall, the young birds, and when they finally come back to breed, usually 3 to 5 years later. So do a quick review of the breeding cycle here. Late April to May is when they first start getting back in the breeding grounds up in our area. Next. About May 15th to July 15th is a nesting period. Next. From mid-July to the end of September is the staging period, or the post-breeding period for birds that we're breeding. Then in October through November, that's basically fall migration. They're moving now down to South America, mostly off the coast of Brazil. And then they spend December through March in the winter areas. They may move around from place to place. They don't stay in the same wintering area the whole time they're down there. Next. And then March to April is when they start beginning spring migration to come back to North America. Now, this is what's going on for the breeding birds. What about the younger non-breeding adults? Like I said, they don't usually come back right off the bat. They're very few. I mean, some do come back as 1-year-olds, but very few of them. We get more coming back as 2s and 3s, but those, generally speaking, are not ready to breed yet. So the question is, where are they? What are they doing? Next. Okay, next slide, please. So in the mid 2000s, we started trying to find out if we could find these birds at the staging sites and identify them there. And I began a collaborative research project between me. I was working for the USGS at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center at the time.
Sorry, Jeff, I muted you accidentally.
Okay. Okay. And at that point, Becky Harris was heading up the program, and Ellen Jedry was a main driver for getting this work done. Next, please. And what we discovered in our first couple of years doing this is that the survival of the young hatch year birds and their eventual recruitment as survivors at breeding birds appear to be major factors limiting the recovery. Like I said in the movie, adult survival seems to be pretty well buffered from year to year. There's only been 1 year when we had a major drop in adult survival, and that was back in 1991 when Hurricane Bob roared through the staging areas in late August. And whereas we normally lose about 1/6 of the breeding adults from year to year, we lost 1/3 of the breeding adults between 1991 and 1992. And whereas normally maybe 30 to 35% of the young come back as breeding birds, that cohort of young, even though it was a very strong cohort, almost got wiped out. And only about 5% of the young from that particular cohort came back as breeding birds in succeeding years. So it's this first year survival, which seems to be the major factor that's limiting how many new birds can join the population. Next slide, please. So when we were doing our work at the colony sites, and we started off with just 4 colony sites in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York, from the 1990s through 2010, we were only able to put color bands on adult birds. And here you see a bird with a 6-band combination. It has the same upper color band on each leg. It happens to be a bicolored band. WB stands for white blue. And then on the left leg, it has a light green band over the service band or BBL band. And on the right leg, it's white blue over purple over field readable. And that's a 4-character metal band. It has 2 characters stamped on the upper row and 2 in the lower row, 2 to 3 times around the band. And while we were working the colony sites, that was sufficient, this sort of situation with these 6-band combos, to be able to identify these birds at a pretty good distance, up to maybe about 75 meters. But again, it's only adults. Next slide, please. And then next again, when I moved from Falkner up to Buzzards Bay and worked there from 2004 to 2010, in that time period, I color banded about 3,550 adults with these 6-band combinations. Next slide, please. Then once we started working out in the staging sites, we discovered that we needed something better than that, because our methods out there was to go find a mixed species flock, pick out the roseates in it. Next, please. Put a scope on it, check out what's color banded, then next. Zoom in with your scope and get your identification. And I can't quite see it here, so I guess you can't either, but that's a bird with upper dark green bands, and on the left, it's got a dark blue band, and then on the right, it has a bicolored white-blue band. So like I said, we could identify these adults, but we had a real hard time trying to get in close enough to read the 4-character bands on the young birds. And if an adult lost one of its middle bands, again, we'd have to get in close enough to read that 4-character band. So next. And this took real dedication. That is Ellen Jedry. She is not kneeling in the water. She is standing up to her chest with a spotting scope, trying to read the bands on those little white dots you see on the far shore there at Hatches Harbor, which is just south of the lighthouse at Race Point at the very tip of Cape Cod. And yes, it can be done, but it's a lot of effort. And in this case, she got pretty chilled doing that. Next slide. So in 2011, we started switching over to using plastic field readable bands. And they're taller than the standard service band, as you can see in the lower right part of that picture. But they have a 3-character complex on it, which is much more readable than the 4-character complex on the metal bands that we had been using it. For that, if you look at that little panel down in the lower left-hand part of the screen, I don't know if any of you can read it, but that's Z711. And it's, I mean, I know what it is, but I'm not sure I could read it right now. But it's much harder to read than the plastic color bands you see in the spread around it there. And whereas you can read the metal bands, if you get within about 15 to 20 meters, the plastic color bands, we can read at distances up to about 50 meters. And if 50 meters doesn't mean as much to you, then I'll use the same terminology I used to tell the people out in the Cape where they're out there in their self-contained vehicles enjoying themselves. That's basically half a football field away. Next slide, please. So using these plastic field readable bands, that's what the PFR stands for, leads to better estimates of both productivity and post-fledging survival, because we can get a better estimate of how many young are actually being reduced to the colony sites, and then how many of those birds can make it down to Cape Cod, and then how many of those guys then are ready to leave to get down to South America. Next slide. So because the young chicks may be led away from their nest sites at a very early age and become difficult to find and even more difficult to handle sometimes, accurate estimates of productivity are hard to obtain at some colony sites. And the extreme example here was they started putting just some solid color bands on young of the year at the furthest most site up in northern Nova Scotia. And they were able to confirm that of the 14 birds that they banded with bands and color bands, 4 of those were known to have reached fledging age. Now, of those 4, we confirmed that 13 of them, and that's not a misnomer, 13 of them made it down to Cape Cod. So basically, we were able to triple their estimate of productivity by the work we did down at Cape Cod, because they couldn't find them back up at the colony site. But we've had a much easier time reading those bands when they once got down to the Cape. Next, please. So our staging site research has increased estimates of productivity from just the colony site data in a rather tremendous way. Next. And that means, since we now have a better estimate of what birds actually were fledged, we can now do a better job of estimating the post-fledging to first breeding survival, which, like I said, normally takes about 3 years. So this is a picture of, or a map of where the bands have been used. And if you look in the lower left-hand part, the original color scheme was we were going to use yellow bands at Falkner Island and Great Gull. We were going to use dark blue bands at the colony sites in Massachusetts, and then red plastic color bands at all these colony sites to the north, New Hampshire, Maine, and up in Canada. And before we leave this slide, I want you to take a look up near where Dennis just had the cursor a minute ago. Way up near the upper right-hand part, you'll see Country Island. Remember how far that is from Cape Cod, because I'll show you another slide later with some interesting stuff about birds from there. And then also the 2 colony sites that are just north of Massachusetts at Seavey Island, New Hampshire, and then Stratton Island, which is the furthest south in the Maine. Because again, I'll have some information about birds from there. They're doing something interesting. So now we're focusing in on Cape Cod itself. Those yellow areas are areas where birds have been identified staging in the past. And it's not a very big area, actually. Ellen calculated there's only 12 square kilometers. But even so, more importantly, so there's only 3 really important areas where the roseate stage in really large numbers, and where, in fact, they might even outnumber the common terns on some days. And those are the 3 areas around Race Point, at Race Point itself, Hatches Harbor, which is just to the southwest of the lighthouse, and then Wood End Flats, which is the area down where the sand sweeps around. And then down in the Monomoy area in North South Beach, Chatham, that's another really important area. And then down at the area that's just west of the western part of Nantucket out to Muskeget, the Muskeget Shoals. That's a large area, very shallow water. It's loaded with sand lance, which are the preferred prey for roseates. And even before we started using the plastic field readable bands, we were using the 6-band combination. In one day down there, I think I identified 215 different birds in a 3-hour period. So I was getting better than a bird a minute down there. They were just so packed in. It was like you have to make the ones closest to you get up and move so you could read the band combinations and the ones further deep in the flock. Now, the other two areas which I didn't mention yet are Jeremy Point and Nauset Estuary. Those have been fairly important areas in the past, but don't seem to be as important anymore. Nauset Estuary, when we first started working there back in the late 2000s, we once had a flock size we estimated up to 14,000 birds in it. But more recently, I've only been getting flocks in between 500 to 1,000 birds down there. So something's changed. The sand lance, I guess, aren't in that close to shore, and the birds aren't using it as much as they used to. Next slide, please. So let me just sort of do a quick review of the potential threats to the birds at these staging sites. Number one is storms, hurricanes. I already mentioned before about Hurricane Bob back in 1991, which had a devastating impact. Basically, you watched 5 years of population growth get wiped out, most likely due almost to a single storm. There's also climate-related shifts in the prey fish, which are going on. Sand lance are being moved out of the area as the waters get warm, and they're being replaced by other cold water species, which are bigger, and the birds don't do as well. They either can't catch them or they're too big for them to feed their young. Next. Wind power arrays. There was originally they proposed 124 turbines for an area within Nantucket Sound that was right in the middle of the routes that the birds use to get from their nocturnal roost sites to their daytime staging areas. And that was of real concern. The array was given a permit, but they weren't able to sell half of the power they needed to sell. So eventually the developer gave up on that. But the fact that he got the permit means they could start putting them in there again if either this, and this array was proposed in federal water so that the state of Massachusetts had virtually no say over what was going to go on there. And the other thing that's important out there is the sand mining of shoals for beach nourishment. The winds and waves in the winter wash away the sand, and they come in and dig up places and replenish that sand. And most of the areas that they use for getting that sand are areas where the prey fish are hiding. And so that's going to impact the ability of the prey fish to become available if their habitat's destroyed. Next. And then, of course, there's human-related disturbance shown here in various ways. We'd gone out to protect a flock. If you can back up on that for a minute, I wasn't quite done. We'd gone out to protect a flock we'd found at Nauset one day, and a guy came out and zoomed between me and the other guy who was there. Parked it, scared up all that flock you see flying up there. Parked his car and then put up a big pennant on the top of it with a picture of a piping plover, a circle, and a slash drawn through it. He was not particularly a bird lover. And then on the upper right-hand side, you can see what the tip of one of those points looks like in the summer, where everybody drives their beach buggies down there, goes out and sunbathes on the beach, and that's the area that the terns would like to be. And then the fourth picture shows the problem we have. Dogs are supposed to be on leash at all times within the Park Service areas, but many people just totally ignore, let their dogs run free. And yes, there's a small flock of terns you can see in between the dogs and where the picture was taken, but those birds are very wary. And I think, as I recall, they flew away at one point when the dogs started coming a little closer. Next. So I don't want to overwhelm you guys with a lot of data slides, but I do want to point out some of the interesting things that we found out. This first slide shows the results of some work done by a master's student, Kayla Davis, who worked with me. She was a student at Virginia Tech. And what she was doing was using capture-recapture models to make estimates of what we're calling the apparent residency, or the survival from one period to a next up on the Cape of the young of the year. And you can see it was pretty consistently high values there from mid-July up until the end of September and into the end of August into early September. But then at that point, things started to drop off, in part because the young of the year were moving out and migrating, but also in part because at that time of the year, rather than leaving the young at the beach while they go out and feed, the adults were taking them out to the foraging areas. And so we were only finding the young of the year like early in the morning or again late in the afternoon when they'd come back from these foraging areas. And that's why the error bars around those estimates are so much bigger, because there's just a much smaller sample size of birds for those last 3 periods. But we have had young roseates even hang around into early November. And there's a fair number there in October. But usually by about mid-September and the last 2 weeks of September, I would say that maybe about half of them would have left the Cape at that point. Next. So let's start looking a little bit at what happens now when the birds start returning in later years. And as I mentioned before, we do have some 1-year-olds come back in that particular Portlandica plumage. I don't know if anyone's seen them in that. Roseates have that plumage, comets have the plumage, arctics have the plumage. It is different from the full adult plumage. You can recognize 1-year-old birds, but we probably have less than 5% of the young that come back as 1-year-olds. We do, however, get a large number of 2-year-olds that come back. And it wasn't until we started using these plastic field readable bands in 2011 that we had a good way of determining what most of the healthy 2-year-olds do, because most of our data in the past was based upon recoveries of dead terns that have been found. And of course, that happens, but that's not the ones we're more interested in. We're interested in what the live guys are doing. And what we've learned now from using these plastic field readable bands is the conventional wisdom that most of them are staying down in South America may not be right. It looks like maybe 40 or maybe even as much as 50% of these birds are coming back as 2-year-old birds and visiting the colony sites. For example, next slide. I'm going to go over 2 birds that were hatched originally at that colony site I pointed out before, way up in Nova Scotia. In 2014, Red C59 came back. I saw him at Hatches Harbor between the 11th and the 15th of July, and then again at Race Point from the 7th through the 24th of August, and also it was down at Chatham later that afternoon, that same day. You'll notice there's a little asterisk there. If you hit the next slide, that's because that bird about 6 days after I last saw it was seen way up back at its natal site at Country Island. Next. 2 years later, the same thing happened. We had red YO4, saw it at Hatches Harbor on July 4th, and again at Race Point North on August 3rd and 11th. Next. As the asterisk shows, again, about the same time of year, late July, 25th of July, it went back to Country Island. If it weren't for those 2 well-timed sightings made at that natal colony site, we would have assumed that those 2 birds had spent the entire area within the greater Cape and Islands. And that, I just hadn't been in places, to see them. So that was really interesting. If you go to the next slide, because those birds made about almost 1,000-mile round trip between the staging sites down there at the Cape, getting back to their natal colony site. They did this in late July. They weren't going to nest. So why did they expend all that energy to go up there? I wish I knew. Next. Yeah. Then this shows temporal variation in the numbers of bands I'm able to identify on an average basis at weekly periods. And I'm not sure how well it shows out here, but 2017 was a really unusual year. Things were going on pretty well up until about August 23rd. And then you'll notice we had really low numbers identified for the next 4-week periods compared to the years both before and after that. And our other data suggests that many of the roseates went west and went down to the Rhode Island, New York area. And for those of you who might have been out there birding at that time, You might remember 2017 was a year that menhaden, small menhaden, started showing up probably by the hundreds of thousands, if not millions or billions, off the coast of Cape Cod. We had shearwaters coming in. I estimate at one point maybe about 10,000 shearwaters I could see right there from the crest of the dune at Race Point North. Some of the birds are actually surfing and on the waves and ending up on the beach. It was just incredible. But what we think was going on was that the menhaden brought in predatory mackerel and then other larger species of fish to feed on them. And this probably drove the sand lance away. And that's why the terns did not spend much time at the Cape that year, and it went elsewhere. And there are also some secondary consequences that of this that turned up in later years, even though in 2018, you can see the numbers I was able to identify on a daily basis basically returned to normal. Next. So I'm going to just give you a few more selected observations of things that we've seen with birds given these plastic field breathable bands. If you remember back to that first picture where I showed you where I was comparing the different types of bands, that bird, red A112, was the first young of the year we ever photographed down on the Cape. Well, we were able to follow its history over a period of several years. And in 2016, it was seen up at Stratton Island, Maine, between May 22nd and 23rd of July, so it probably nested there. The day after it was seen, the last it was seen at Stratton Island, I saw it down at Race Point North and at Hatches Harbor. And the day after that, it was seen off Rhode Island. So once this bird left Maine, it was on the move. Next. That same bird was seen, red 812, the next year. I saw it between, it was seen between June and mid-July up at Stratton. I then had it for several days at Hatches Harbor. It then flew back up to Stratton Island last day after I saw it at Hatches. And then we don't know what happened for the next 2 weeks, but on August 8th, it showed up at Great Gull Island. Again, one of those birds that probably moved as a result of the fact that they couldn't find sand lance around the Cape. Next. There was another bird, red V24. I'm not going to go through all this, but basically this bird made at least 3 round trips between Cape Cod and southern Maine in a 10-day period. Then it disappeared for about a month. We didn't see it at all in August. And then it came back and was seen several more times in late September there at the Cape. So where it was in August, I don't know. Might have been back up north. It might have gone around to Rhode Island or Great Gull. Next. And then this is a secondary consequence. These 2 birds were originally banded at Seavey Island, New Hampshire. And in 2018, they were both seen at Pond Island, Maine on the 30th of May. So one would have expected they would stay and nest there. But then they were both seen together in early July at Great Gull Island, which suggests that they did not nest up in Maine, but came back down and actually went to Great Gull to nest. And then in late July, I had them out at Hatches Harbor. Again, they basically disappeared for about a month. And then one of them was seen again in early September back at Hatches. So these are birds which, if we'd been really lucky and had radios on, we probably could have found out some really neat things. This is just sort of a taste of what can be done. Next slide. So I'll start wrapping up now. The most recent results that we're getting out of this research out of the staging sites is that we're finding out there are large numbers of non-breeding roseates that are using these staging areas for extensive periods of time while the breeders are still at the colony sites. We have a fair number of these birds that are showing up even in late June and early July before the first young of the year start showing up around somewhere between the 11th and the 15th of July. Next. We were detecting substantial variation in the number of non-breeding roseates that migrate north to the US and Canada from their winning areas. Some years we get a lot of 2s and 3s, some years not so much. Next. And again, we can only assume this is due to differences in the availability of fish back down in the wintering areas. If there's a lot of fish down there, there's no reason for them to come north. There's a 3-month window in which events in a limited area could impact nearly the entire population since they're so concentrated there on the Cape. And the Park Service areas and the Fish and Wildlife Service has 2 refuges there at Monomoy and again at the very northern tip of Nantucket. Those areas are critically important to the recovery and conservation of this species. Next. So basically to summarize, I've got 2 summary slides here. Virtually all of the Northwest Atlantic roseate terns congregate in Cape Cod and Islands area of Massachusetts before migration. Some individuals may stay for up to 8 weeks. We suspect that the roseates are staying longer than locally breeding common terns, and therefore the roseates have a longer at-risk period to the threats I mentioned before. Jump in now. A lot more people are starting to ban common terns with these plastic field readable bans. We're starting to get some interesting results from that. At Great Gull Island last year, they banned 100 roseate chicks and 100 common tern chicks. I saw 26 of their roseate terns as HYs. I only saw 1 of their commons as an HY. But I also saw 1 common tern that had been banded that last year down at the mouth of Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. It moved up north, and I saw it in mid-September. There may be considerable variation in movements of these adults, and this is probably influenced in part by whether or not they're taking care of young. Adults that aren't taking care of young are free to go wherever they want. Adults that are taking care of young need to hang by close. They can't just take the young off anywhere until the young are strong enough and they're getting to the point where they can learn how to feed on their own. These movements may reflect temporal changes in the availability of forage fish, but there do seem to be consistent hot spots for staging terns around Cape Cod from year to year. If you want to go up and see a roseate tern, you've never seen one before, go to Hatches Harbor. Anytime from mid-July to early September, you can almost be guaranteed of seeing one, at least one there any day. Next. The roseates from the north, from New Hampshire, Maine, and Nova Scotia, arrive in Cape Cod earlier and seem to be staying longer than the ones that are coming from Connecticut and New York, which you'd say, well, why is that? They're much closer from Connecticut and New York. And the reason we think is because there are better feeding grounds off of Long Island that these birds are using. So they don't need to get out to the Cape as fast as the birds that are up north are. They need to come down pretty quick because the fish are starting to move offshore up there in those northern waters. We suspect we will find similar differences in the use of the Cape Cod area by breeding adults from the north versus south, but we haven't done a formal analysis of that yet. In some years, these birds are making multiple back and forth trips between the staging and the colony site areas. Again, presumably it's because they're going to wherever the fish are. And if they can't find the fish down at the staging areas, they're going back up to the breeding areas to try to get them up there. We expect to find major differences in the use of the area by breeding adults versus non-breeding adults. And as we've just were able to see in the last couple of years, birds that are originating from one of the regions, either the cold water areas up north versus the warm water areas in Connecticut and New York and Buzzards Bay, if they're visiting colony sites in the other region during multiple staging periods, this allows them the opportunity to recruit and start becoming breeding in the other region from which they hatched. And this is what is causing gene flow between the birds. So it doesn't take much. It's just a little bit to keep all the birds pretty, what I want to say, consistent gene-wise. There's no genetic differentiation between the birds in the north and the birds in the south. Next, and I think this is my last slide. I've gone through a lot of stuff. I don't expect you guys to remember all of it, but there are a couple of take-home messages I really hope that you do remember. Number one is that northward migration of the young non-breeding birds may be occurring at a much higher rate and is a much more complex process than we first thought based on recoveries of dead birds. So using these plastic field readable bands is giving us a chance to learn a lot more about what these guys are doing. Next. And the events and activities in this area could impact a much greater percentage of the population than we once suspected. Even though they're not, there's a good number that breed there in the western part of Cape Cod. Basically, almost all these guys are coming to the Cape at some point before they leave to head to South America. And the proof of this is, like I said before, Hurricane Bob in 1991 virtually wiped out the entire cohort of young birds that had been produced that year. And finally, next, Is the Cape Cod area the metagalactic hub of roseate migration? Well, that's what I like to think. And I'd be glad to take any questions. Thank you for your patience.
Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, do you want me to go ahead and start answering questions from the chat?
Sure.
Okay, Allison asks, how does the adults recognize the offspring when they return with the fish by call? And the answer is yes. You'll see lots of adults coming back with fish giving the chivot call, but if you're looking at the right young, you can see him really perk up, and then the adult will fly over it and call it out of the flock, take it off a little ways off where there's no other activity going on and feed it. The common terns are less likely to do this, and I don't know if you saw, there was an example of a laughing gull stealing a fish that had just been delivered to a young common tern in the movie. And then Jean asks, any preference to go from leg bands to radio telemetry tags? We have been doing some radio telemetry on them. I haven't been doing it myself. You're limited there more by the cost of the tags that you're using, and we have had some problems. They started trying to put satellite tags, these are tags that talk to satellites up above, on the roseates, but they didn't do enough checking with the common terns first to make sure it was safe. And we had a real problem with the roseates trying to preen these tags out of the back and getting the bills stuck in there. And unfortunately, within a 2-week period, they lost 9 of the 10 birds that they tried that with. Only one of them gave them data. So we're trying to be a little more cautious now on that. And I don't see any other questions in the chat at the moment. But if anyone has any, just unmute yourself and holler, and I'll do my best.
Do you have any idea what the mortality is for the young birds?
Like I said, only about 30 to 35% come back as breeding birds. We suspect that the survival rate between year 1 and year 2 and year 3 and year 3 and year 4 is pretty similar to the adult birds. And if that is the case, that means that most of the mortality is occurring that very first winter. And in all probability, it's something on the order of almost 50% of the young that are leaving the Cape don't ever come back as breeding birds, or at least don't make it to breeding age. We haven't done a formal analysis using capture recapture of this once we started using the plastic field breathable bands. That information I just gave was birds. It's based on information from when we were just putting BBL bands and metal bands on those guys back in the late 80s and the mid 1990s through the early 2000s.
Any other questions, people? All right. Well, thanks, Jeff. Incredible amount of data there. And oh, wait, here's somebody. Oh, no, thank you from Sue. And thank you from me and the rest of us. And remember, check the website for the links to sign up for the future Zoom programs, and we'll see you next month. So in the meanwhile, take care, everybody.
But before you shut it down, did you see one last question that came in the chat? It was just to me. It says, what's the best way to tell the difference between a common tern and a roseate tern? The roseates are lighter gray on the back, and during the breeding season, they have much longer tail streamers. During the staging period, they start to molt, so that doesn't work so well, but they also have longer bills, and they don't have as much pinkish at the base of the bills as common terns do. And for the young of the year, the young roseates have black legs. The young common terns have flesh-colored legs. And thank you for all the thank yous I see coming in. And it's good to see some old faces, or at least the names of some longtime friends.
This has been great. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.